My name's Mel Punton. This is my colleague Liz Turner. We're both consultants at ITAD, which is an international development consultancy based in Brighton. So we work on lots of large-scale evaluations at ITAD on all kinds of things, mainly across Africa and Asia. And we work across many sectors: health, social development, private sector development, education, empowerment and accountability, to name but a few. So why did ITAD start doing realist evaluations? Firstly, clients are increasingly starting to ask us not just what works, but also why. And ITAD has quite a close relationship with the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Sussex. We, over the past few years, have set up the Centre for Development Impact, which is a partnership between us and IDS. And through that, we have quite a close relationship with researchers. And over the past few years, we've been talking to researchers at IDS and seeing them start to use realist evaluation and other methodologies, which we've started to bring into our own evaluations. So we thought realist evaluation, that can help us answer this why question. I think the other thing that we've recently started to see with realist evaluation is where donors are asking these sorts of questions: can we scale the intervention up? Can we roll this intervention out? And I think realist evaluation has the potential to reframe these sorts of questions. It becomes instead, rather than will this intervention work on a larger scale or in a different country, instead you're starting to think about the mechanisms, because of course we all know, I'm preaching to the converted here, that the intervention isn't the thing that makes people's lives change. The question is, what are the mechanisms that bring about change in particular contexts, and can we replicate whatever it is that sparks this mechanism somewhere else, or on a larger scale in a different country? What do we need to know in order to do that about how people or groups or systems react to the resources provided by the programme? So ultimately, I think our use of realist evaluation is driven by the questions that donors are asking. It's not a methods-led thing, it's a questions-led decision. I'm saying that we're currently conducting 5 realist evaluations in ITAD, and this is a very new world to us. It made me laugh a bit yesterday, Anna, when Anna said that she describes herself as a junior realist researcher with 11 years experience, and ITAD have 1 year experience and counting, so we're sort of taking baby steps and occasionally falling over, but we're learning a lot as we go. So the example that I'll talk about today is this first one, an evaluation of a building capacity to use research evidence programme. And Liz is working on 3 other evaluations, one of regional market development programmes in East, Southern and Central Africa, and a Tanzania agricultural and roads programme. So all of these evaluations are funded by the Department for International Development, or DFID, which is one of our biggest clients. So the building capacity to use research evidence programme, just a brief introduction. The starting assumption of this programme is that policymaking in low and middle income countries is often not evidence informed, and that this is partly because policymakers lack the capacity to use evidence effectively. So that's the starting assumption for the programme. And what the programme is trying to do about this, starting in these orange boxes, is firstly build the capacity of policymakers to understand evidence, to access it, to appraise it, quality assess it, synthesize it, and ultimately apply it in policymaking. And capacity building is not just happening at a kind of individual level, it's also happening at organisational and institutional levels too, recognising that there are lots of different levels to a system. The way the programme is doing this is through the interventions in the stars, so training, mentoring, networking events, new tools, systems and guidelines. And the hope is that this will lead to evidence being used more and better by policymakers, and that this will lead to better quality policy, whatever that is. But basically, those are the outcomes that we're looking at, this idea that these interventions can A, build capacity, B, make policy more evidence-informed, and C, improve the quality of policy. The programme's being implemented in 11 countries, and we're doing case studies in 5. So we're doing case studies in India, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Kenya, and Sierra Leone, which are obviously incredibly different contexts. And the program's being implemented in very different ways. So training in one country means an online training course, and civil servants sit in a computer lab and do the training. In another country, training means a 5-day residential, where civil servants go outside of the city and spend 5 days learning about evidence-informed policy. And the program's targeting very different groups. So the program in some countries is targeting cabinet officials, excellent, yay. And in other countries it's targeting mid-level civil servants. So basically it's quite a complex program, very ambitious, and it's being implemented in very different ways. And basically as our program theory has developed, it started to look something like this. So we really jumped in the deep end. Jill yesterday talking about complex interventions and whether realist evaluation is appropriate. We sort of just assumed that it was and dived straight in, and it's just been a very steep learning curve for us. But DFID want to know what works, why, and can we scale it up, and can we do it elsewhere? All of these questions. So some of the particular challenges we've faced in BCure and some of Liz's programs too. Some of these are specific to international development. Others are, I'm sure you'll recognise from your own sectors. The first one is that this is a new way of thinking for us. There's so many elements to realist evaluation that are new to us. The generative model of causality, the realist interview and how you do it, and of course the CMOs, and we sort of feel like we've been chased by the CMO police for the past year and we're only just escaping with our lives. But I think more than just the challenges of learning a new methodology, which everyone faces, is the issue that most of our work as an international development consultancy doesn't take place in the UK. Obviously it takes place in countries across Africa and Asia, and we work through international research partners. The data collection, we don't do that. It's done by local researchers on the ground, often managed by international consultants who are very experienced and have many years of experience in their fields, but they don't know about realist evaluation either. So it's quite difficult to get them to adopt realist thinking and to get the data collection being done in a way that is realist, especially as we don't often have a lot of face-to-face time with the realist researchers on the ground. So that's a real challenge. The second one, and I'm kind of speaking about DFID, the Department for International Development here, but this is relevant to clients more broadly. So DFID is funding several realist evaluations. They're interested in this methodology. They like it. It's innovative. They like the idea of knowing what works in different contexts and why and for whom, and they get that context matters, so they're on the same page with that. And it sort of fits into this new talk about adaptive programming that started to filter into international development. Adaptive programming basically means being ready and willing to adapt your program rapidly and flexibly to changing contexts rather than sticking with a rigid implementation plan from the start. DFID are interested in adaptive programming, they're starting to think about it. So there's lots, and we think there's lots in common between realist evaluation and adaptive programming, which we're not going to go into here. I think Gabriel might pick up on some of these points in the next presentation. But it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on some of those synergies. So on the one hand, DFID are on board with realist evaluation, they like it, they get it. But on the other hand, DFID also want to know what works. And there's a lot of pressure from ministers, from throughout DFID for one-page briefing notes that say, this is what you should fund, this is what works, this is what you should scale up, this is what you should roll out. And DFID policymakers and commissioners of evaluation often have limited time to engage in the way that they want and we want in the evaluation process. And there's also all of these internal systems and processes and incentives that are not that conducive to realist evaluation. Things like the business case format and the log frame and the annual review process, all of these things that different policymakers have to use to hold their programs to account, they're often very rigid, they're not very flexible, and they increase pressure on these what works answers. So there is, despite this willingness for realist evaluation and the sorts of questions it can answer, there is a bit of a paradigm clash that we're trying to navigate that is quite difficult. So these first two questions lead to these first two challenges lead to challenge number 3, which is how do we talk about realist evaluation and engage policymakers and other practitioners and our researchers effectively And we've actually found it quite difficult sometimes to talk about realist evaluation in an accessible, straightforward way that people understand. This is partly because we're early on in our journey of realist evaluation and we're still working out how it works. But we need to find a way to demystify it for the client. The fourth challenge is about data. It's about a year ago I read Realistic Evaluation, and I read the example of the Canadian Prisoner Education Programme, one of the first applications of realist evaluation. And I was reading with envy about this huge data set that you were dealing with, that, this huge data set about prisoner characteristics and participation rates in these education programs and reoffending rates, etc. You could examine this data for patterns of outcomes, which you could then develop theories around and go in and test. But in BCure, our data sources are really limited. We basically have the monitoring data of the partners, which is often really patchy and not very good. And we have qualitative interviews. We're measuring policy change and policy processes, and it's difficult to find quantitative data of that. We often can't get access to the sorts of documents that might give us data, so we're relying often on qualitative interviews. And these interviews need to give us not just our mechanisms, our theories, they need to give us our C's and our O's as well. So we're asking a lot from our interviews. We're asking them to tell us about outcomes and potential contextual factors and what the situation is in these countries, as well as testing our theories. That's a lot to do in an interview. And I think that's generalizable to international development more broadly. There are often data challenges. We often don't have all the data that we want and need to test our theories robustly. We have to collect data from scratch. And that crowds out space for theory building and theory testing within the resources we have available to do evaluation. And the last challenge is quite a specific one about the realist evaluation, the realist interview, sorry. This idea of making your theory explicit in an interview, putting it up for inspection, asking your respondents to comment on your theory and help you refine it. In BCure, we found there were kind of cultural challenges to this concept. There were power dynamics at play that made that difficult between the researcher and the respondent. So in some cultures, it's rude to disagree, or it's not usual to assert alternative opinions. It might be seen as rude to challenge the researcher, who is obviously seen as a respected person. And it's difficult to therefore kind of explicitly test your theory without fearing that people are just agreeing with you and resulting in serious confirmation bias. So these are some of the challenges that we've been grappling with in the very early stages of our realist evaluation journey. And so they lead on to some questions for you that we'd like you to consider at the end. Firstly, how do we talk to clients and commissioners about realist evaluation? Secondly, can realist evaluation be used for adaptive programming? What are the kind of synergies between these two ideas? Any tips and tricks you have for inducting researchers into realist methods, which we would find really useful? And finally, how do you conduct good realist interviews while avoiding confirmation bias? Thank you very much.